They probably couldn't come up with creative or innovative solutions if they were older. And also they eliminated based on family status because they thought that if they had kids, then maybe they shouldn't be traveling. So that got me to thinking about this subject. And I thought that maybe if I can explore some of the values in having a multi-generational workforce, then there might be more incentive to include age in diversity and inclusion policies. So through my research, I found out that there's 4 generations in the workforce today. And first, I'm going to say that generational constructs are subjective. So not everybody is going to fit into these molds. And basically, they came up with these generations because of the shared experiences that people born during these years have had. And shared experiences often create shared values and characteristics. And so that's how they came up with this, but we need to be very careful in trying to fit everybody into these molds. And we need to be careful of stereotypes also. So the first generation is the baby boomer generation. And there was a high birth rate right after World War II, and they experienced things such as the JFK assassination. A lot of them had to go to Vietnam, and they experienced the civil rights movement. So this made them have a lot of experience with controversy and conflict. So some of the common characteristics and values that baby boomers have are that they're comfortable with the hierarchy, they're team players, they're very loyal, they're goal-oriented, and they're comfortable with changing the world. So some negative stereotypes that have been seen by other generations against baby boomers are that they are resistant to change and they're too rigid with the chain of command, and also that they're loyal to a fault. Generation X is the next generation. And this generation is called the middle generation. And they got to experience things like the punk rock movement, metal, and they were the first ones to be young when MTV came around. They also were the first latchkey kids, which meant that both of their parents were working. And they experienced the dot-com boom and bust. And so this made them very resilient, flexible. They're also cynical though, and they question authority and tradition. The next one on the list are the millennials, and they're the largest population in the workforce today. So millennials have gone through things like the Berlin Wall falling. They also went through September 11th, and they went through the Great Recession and energy crisis, and they also experienced a technology explosion. So some characteristics and values that millennials hold are that they're technologically savvy. They're also goal-oriented, they're very inclusive, and they value role clarity. So they need to know what it is they're supposed to be doing. And they also value flexible work hours. Now, millennials actually have a lot of stereotypes about them. And so some of those stereotypes include them being patient, unmotivated, and entitled. The last generation in the workforce, the youngest one, is Gen Z, and they are called the technology natives. Some of their experiences, the biggest one is the technological explosion that's happened since they've been young. They don't know what life is like without technology. They've experienced a rising wealth gap, and they've also seen a highly polarized political world more than the other generations. And they've seen the pandemic now. So some common characteristics and values that they hold are that they're ambitious, they're completely integrated with technology, and they have increased anxiety more than the other generations. Also, they value recognition. And some negative stereotypes that are held against Gen Z from other generations are that they're unable to communicate, they're too protected, or they have all adversity removed, and that they disrespect authority. So considering all of these differences, what types of outcomes do these teams produce? Well, there's mixed conclusions, and really the mixed conclusions are because these teams need the right environment. The right environment is going to yield more effective solutions, higher levels of innovation, and enhanced quality and maturity of solutions. So what is the right environment? The right environment is when people's individual strengths are recognized, when they feel like their contributions matter. It's also when they have a charismatic leader, and charismatic leaders are respected and trusted, and they also do the same to the members of the team. Also, each member needs to be included in the decision-making processes. So unfortunately, and fortunately at the same time, common interpersonal conflict can come about because of these differences in characteristics and values and stereotypes. For example, one generation might be more technology oriented, or another one's not as comfortable with technology, and one might be more comfortable with the chain of command, while the other one is completely bucking against the chain of command. Are there positive effects from team level conflict? Yes. So when the status quo is challenged, positive social change can come about. And also when the status quo is challenged, it prevents groupthink. Groupthink is not good for a team because it's when all of the team members just start thinking one way because they want to agree. But the problem is that that stops creative solutions and innovation. So once groupthink is prevented with conflict, more creative solutions come, and then team psychological safety is built. And team psychological safety is when people have experienced conflict in the team and they see how it turned out, and they see that it is safe for them to voice their ideas and challenge other ideas and be themselves. So there's also negative effects from team level conflict. And when conflict is not mitigated by an inclusive environment, these effects can become a lot more pronounced. What benefits on the organizational level do these multi-generational teams have? Well, once again, there's mixed conclusions. It depends on the right environment. And we mentioned what that environment was earlier. Things that it does help on the organizational level when we have the right environment is knowledge transfer. Knowledge transfer is important because when employees leave, if there's not good knowledge transfer, then they take their expertise and their experiences with them. But when knowledge transfer happens, it is transferred to the organization. So it's also social and human capital. Performance is also enhanced. And then there's a good effect on other diversity and inclusion programs. That's because, so if employees sense that one area of diversity of inclusion is being discriminated against, then they sense hypocrisy. And when employees sense hypocrisy in an organization, then it can affect their attitude and their commitment to the organization. So what does the research show about individual level outcomes? Well, employee satisfaction when there's age diverse groups is increased when there's higher outcome interdependence within the group. So that means when everybody's outcome depends on each other, then employee satisfaction is increased in these groups. Also, when these multi-generational teams are together longer, employee satisfaction is increased. Employee retention. So an interesting finding is that employees actually stayed at organizations more often and longer when there was higher age diversity within the teams. Also, personal growth is increased through conflict. So conflict forces people to use their skills and abilities and talents to really the maximum capacity. And so people grow through this maximized use of their skills and talents. So what does an effective multi-generational team look like? All of the members have a perceived or real. I mean, as long as it's perceived, and then that's the most important thing, sense of value and worth and competency. They need to know that their contributions matter. When there are harmful stereotypes that are being perpetuated within the team, they need to be challenged, and then appreciation needs to be shown for the differences. And also charismatic leadership. And a charismatic leader will not only be trusted, but they will build trust and communication within the team. So that all sounds really good. So what are some steps that we can take? Well, first, a step is to create a written shared value system. So this is important to have before the team is functioning, because since there are so many values and goals within the team, it can create conflict. But when the team puts together their shared values and goals, then it creates a standard for operating, and it also creates shared norms. So they know what way they're going to communicate and how often they need to communicate. So it mitigates a lot of things. The role value that each member has is supposed to be highlighted. So say, for instance, they value technology or using technology in their role. That needs to be highlighted within their role. Peer mentoring is important because it helps people to appreciate each other's expertise, and it gives a one-on-one relationship. It helps build bonds between the generations. Also, effectively integrating technology. That means ensuring that there's the right training and ensuring that there's not too much use of technology at the wrong time, and make sure they have the right software. And then the last one is flexible team meeting formats. One generation might feel more comfortable with face-to-face interaction, where another one might be way more comfortable with just messaging. And so when teams have meetings, they need to go back and forth between those different formats or be flexible with the formats. So these are my references. So, and in summary, basically multi-generational teams can make the workforce more innovational. It can increase employee retention. And then as long as there's the right environment, these can be a lot more effective than homogeneous teams or teams without age diversity. Thank you very much. And are there any questions now, or are we waiting until the end?
No, we'll just go ahead with the questions now. I think this is the best time to ask any questions.
Okay.
Alexis, I was wondering, when you say the right environment, does the literature say anything about that?
Yes, it does. When I was explaining the right environment, like recognizing individual strengths and the high appreciation of age diversity, because in some environments there is a low appreciation for age diversity. And so what that looks like is that employees feel that their contributions matter. And so a lot of generations, like especially the older ones, might feel when there's new procedures implemented and they're not as used to technology, they might feel like their contributions aren't mattering as much. Or if the other generations are doing things in a different manner because they're more comfortable with using technology or communicating in a different way, then they might not feel as if they're mattering a lot. So they need to feel like they matter. And it's really the same with like ethnic diversity or other forms of diversity as it is with age diversity. There needs to be an inclusive environment. And so that environment is really important to the functioning of these teams. So yes, a lot of studies, I pulled that from a lot of different studies and put that together.
And I really like the idea of you bringing in the conflict issue. Typically, people think that conflict should be avoided. What was your understanding from the literature about team conflict?
Well, I know to begin with, I had learned about the different stages of group development, and it's forming, norming, or storming, and then norming, and then performing. And so I know during the storming stage, there is a lot of conflict, but that conflict produces bonds that helps them to perform. So because I knew that already, I thought that maybe within these teams, the conflict that they were experiencing could produce positive benefits. And so I was able to find that in the literature when it was talking about conflict within the teams. the positive as well as the negative benefits. And then I was also able to find ways to mitigate conflict. And so yes, there's a lot of different mitigation factors, and I couldn't include it in the PowerPoint because it would have been too long.
Yeah. But it's interesting, right? I mean, imagine that something which typically commonsensically has been understood to be debilitating, like, we should try to avoid conflict. But then if we avoid conflict, then maybe on the other hand, we have got groupthink emerging.
Right.
So a healthy dose of conflict, as you mentioned, is actually good to bring the people together. And as you mentioned, for people to see that if conflict is not there, then the team is pretty much a dull team, right? But
Right.
if the conflict goes beyond a certain level, then that hurts the team performance too. So I think that's a learning for pretty much everyone who's listening to this presentation, that when you do detailed research, you find out things which commonsensically might seem, just in black and white, that conflict is bad and that's it. But there are shades, and those shades then bring out the true knowledge about these issues. So that's interesting about conflict that you discussed. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you, Alexis. Appreciate the presentation.
Thank you.
The next presenter is Jay Doshi. Jay, I don't have much on your bio. I just have the fact that you're a sophomore at UNCG and a political science major. Would you like to say something about yourself? And I'll just go ahead and announce your paper title. It's How Taxation of the Wealthy Leads to Diminishing Returns in the Aggregate US Tax Revenue and Its Impacts on Ordinary Citizens.
Yeah, so when I submitted my paper, I was just a political science major, and now I'm a poli-sci with a concentration in pre-law and finance, and a finance major. So there's that too. And yeah, that's it.
That's it? Okay, go ahead.
But yeah, screen. Yeah. So hi, my name is Jay Doshi, and my paper is titled The Illusion of Taxation. So I'm sure you've all heard the old proverb, 2 things in life you can't avoid, death and taxes. And truth be told, death might be a little less boring to talk about, but if you bear with me for the next 10 minutes, I'll try my best to make it well worth your time. Before I explain what my presentation is about, I'd like to talk about what it's not about. This presentation is not about making normative arguments about what the tax rate should be or how much certain individuals should pay. We all have our biases, especially in this subject, so I'll try my best to tread the middle ground, but truthfully, you're very likely to see my bias throughout the course of this presentation. But to mitigate the impact of my bias, I'd like to stay as objective as possible and try to show exactly why it's not possible to tax the rich, no matter your intentions. As evidence for the fact that the rich don't pay the tax that's applied to them, no matter what rate it is, I'd like to direct your attention to the next slide. This graph was created by the Tax Foundation that compiled 64 years worth of tax rates and receipts. The red lines show the marginal rate that was applied to the top income earners, and the blue lines show the receipts. In other words, what they paid. As you can see, at no point in time did they ever pay anything more than 20%. To elaborate on exactly why this is, I'd like to talk about the way top income earners were taxed in the 1950s, the different ways Florida and California taxed their residents, and finally, the Billionaire Tax Proposal. I chose these 3 in particular because I think they outline the problem with every single feudal attempt to tax the rich. In the 1950s, the statutory marginal tax rate on the rich was 91%, and there were 24 different tax brackets that ranged all the way from the lowest income earners being 20% and the highest 91%. So if you were making any money at all, in all reality, you were paying 30, 40, sometimes even 50%. And much of the reason we support higher tax rates like 91% on the wealthy is to solve income inequality. But this created inequality beyond anything else. The tax code at the time was 11,000 pages. Page 1 said any and all income is taxable, and page 2 set out what the marginal rates were in the 24 different margins. The other 10,998 pages were exceptions to these two pages. Now, which is primarily how the wealthy avoided paying taxes at the time. Now, I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole because I'll touch on this a little later. But although it's not possible to tax the top income earners, it's very, very possible to tax the middle class. Now, let's look at the different ways California and Florida use to tax their citizens. I'm not making a claim as to which one's better or worse, but the two states clearly have a very different way of taxing their residents. Florida has no income tax, but it has a sales and business tax. California, on the other hand, has an income tax, but more importantly, it treats short-term and long-term capital gains as ordinary income and gets a much larger sum of its tax revenue from capital gains. Now, you can make your own observations, but it's clear the volatility of the blue lines, California, is significantly larger than the red lines, Florida. So what I'm trying to get at is that the revenue stream isn't predictable at all in California. Now, this isn't to say you can't make this system work. You can certainly make a capital gains hinge system work. All you would have to do is take the excess money from a good year in the stock market and make it cover for a bad year. Now, but this isn't very plausible. This is because of the fundamental nature of politics. Telling your voters that you took their tax money to do absolutely nothing with it seems like a pretty easy way to get kicked out of office. And lastly, the Billionaire Tax Proposal. Now, this tax proposal changes taxes the change in the value of the underlying asset, even if you haven't sold it yet. Now, if this is a little confusing or vague or doesn't really make much sense, that's because it doesn't make any sense. There's a boatload of problems with this form of taxation and the bill in and of itself. If the stock goes up, it makes sense. You pay a tax on the price that you paid and the price that it's at right now. But what happens when you have a period when the stock goes down? Would the government pay the billionaires a difference? Also, what rate's being applied? And another problem is how micro-targeted this bill is. It's aimed at anyone who made over $1 billion or $100 million for 3 years consecutively. Now, there are a lot more problems with this bill, but the last one that I want to touch on is exactly where is this money coming from? A lot of the time we forget the billionaires don't exactly have a large vault of cash just laying around, but the truth is they don't. Now, taking the far-fetched assumption that they pay the tax, they would be forced to sell their stock in large quantities in order to come up with the cash to pay this tax. While bigger companies like Amazon or Google might be able to withstand this kind of selling, smaller companies would get destroyed and are much more likely to go under. This is because when you sell a stock, it hurts the price of it. Now, to elaborate on the bit about stock values going down, what if we had implemented this bill during the 2000 and 2009 decade? Not only would the government have not gotten anything from the top income earners, they might have even had to pay them, which defeats the entire purpose of taxation. Now, I know that was a lot, but to sort of tie all of this together, there are three main problems you'll see with every single tax law on the wealthy. And I will address them more directly in the next few slides. The first is micro-targeting, which affects every single tax law on the wealthy. The second is it's tied to a volatile stream of income. We saw this when we looked at the different way California and Florida tax their citizens. And the last one is the vagueness of the tax code. We hit on this when we talked about the billionaire tax. Now let's directly dive into the problems with these. The first is micro-targeting. As a general rule, taxes that are broad-based and affect a lot of people deliver more predictable revenue streams than those that affect a very narrow subset of the population. more directly, if there's one thing that the top income earners have that the other classes don't, it's an absurd amount of money. So targeting this class is targeting the class that has the most amount of money and the resources to mitigate the impact of any conceivable attempt to tax them. They could fight this tax in any number of ways. This could be through the best tax attorneys, accountants in the world, investment vehicles, sometimes paying off lobbyists, or even using tax exemptions like donating to charities. Now, the problem with tying a tax to a volatile stream of income is that you can't predict what the revenues are going to be. Now, this hierarchy of predictability doesn't really exist. I just made it up for the purposes of the presentation, but I think it outlines my point pretty clearly. Out of all the forms of taxation, salary, sales, capital gains, any number of things, taxes that are based on revenues or sales yield more predictable revenue streams than taxes that are based on salary income. And taxes that are based on salary income yield more predictable revenue streams than those that are based on capital gains. Now, this makes sense because as you go up this hierarchy, the volatility increases as well, right? So your profits in the stock market or capital gains usually change much more on a year-to-year basis than the prices that your local farmers market would be, which would be the revenues and sales. And lastly, vagueness of the tax code. It's the most simple to understand. It's very easy to find loopholes when there's a lack of structure, right? This leaves a lot of room for attorneys to make very strong arguments in court. As you saw in the Billionaire Tax Proposal, there were a lot of questions that the actual proposal didn't really address. So in sum, Congress is not very good at making tax law. In fact, they're quite bad at it. But because every single tax law that they can pass on the wealthy is either highly micro-targeted, tied to a volatile stream of income, or vague. But it's also not entirely their fault. Members of Congress have a certain party line obligation. So even if they can't do anything, they at least have to make it look like they're trying. Now imagine a Democrat coming out and telling their voters that it's not possible to tax the wealthy. So they're going to focus their efforts elsewhere. I mean, call me speculative, but I don't think Nancy Pelosi would take too kindly to that. And finally, the last little bonus point I just wanted to touch on was that the biggest billionaires in the world actually really support these tax laws. Why do you think Warren Buffett, Bill Gates, or Mike Bloomberg are all Democrats that support very high tax rates on their own income class? As I've shown throughout the course of this presentation, the highest income earners in the biggest companies don't pay these taxes, and they never will. So the only people these rates are really hurting are the smaller up and coming competitors whose profits are running razor thin margins. Now, all of a sudden, instead of Apple having to buy out a company every 2 months to keep a monopoly on the industry, these tax laws destroy them for them, saving the companies a lot of money. Thank you.
Any questions for Jay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, Alexis.
Hi. Okay, so that was really great. It was really interesting. I've always wondered, because I've read recently that they don't pay taxes, and I was wondering how they get out of it. So thank you for this presentation. That's really good. But I do have a couple questions, and the first one is, what's an underlying asset? I know that was a few slides back.
So an underlying asset could be something that's hinged on something else. So like something that's tied to something else. Like let's say you have a stock, right? That could be the underlying asset, or gold, or anything like that.
Okay, so it's like it's the stock would be tied to the performance of the company, or the the projected performance of the company, right? Okay.
Yeah.
And then my second question is, why, I understand why capital gains is more volatile, but why are salary incomes more volatile than revenue and sales?
Right, that's a great question. So barring the last 3 years, right? Because COVID happened. So with the hierarchy of predictability, it was more so a general rule. So typically people make a lot more or earn a lot more. Like what I'm trying to say is they get more raises, right? For example, rather than when you go to your local farmer's market, you expect milk, let's say, to be at $1.50, right? You're not gonna go from year to year basis. That's probably not gonna change 20% like your salary would. And that also really strongly depends on what your job is, right? Because in investment, someone who works in investment banking, their job definitely changes, their salary changes a lot more than someone who would work at your local Starbucks.
Okay.
So certainly, I mean, it's not by a very substantial margin like it is with capital gains and everything else, but it's a little more stable.
Okay, thank you very much.
Of course. Thank you for the question.
Anyone else has a question? So Jay, where did this motivation for this topic come from?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you. Did you say the question?
Where did your motivation to study this issue, where did that come from?
So I've always actually really been interested in finance. It's just that this topic in particular, a while ago, I read an article about Amazon paying $0 in taxes. And I was like, how can that be? So I decided to do a little more research, and the more I got into the subject, the more I really started to like really enjoy reading about tax rates. And there's also a lot of data manipulation as well that goes on. There's a lot of numbers that people, a lot of games people play with numbers as well. Like recently, the White House released an article saying that the top income earners are only paying 8% in taxes, right? But then as you read the article and read more and more, it's not taking percentage of taxes paid as a percentage of taxable income. It's a percentage of taxes paid if they sold every single asset every single year. So it's not true that they're paying 8% either. And it's only taking the top 400 people, not everyone in the top income class. So sort of the complexity of it was what kept me going in it. I really enjoy the subject.
Who's your faculty advisor?
I didn't have one. I actually wrote this paper on my own.
Oh, okay. So the next question would be, when you research a topic like this, there are probably 2 or 3 categories where you see yourself going in future. The first category is, as you understand the system more, you want to become somebody who can beat the system. And that's where people who are the mega rich, they have understood the system, right? That's how, and at some point of time, they decided that, okay, I'm going to be somebody who exploits this system. The second category would be someone who says, I'm going to challenge this and bring people to, some sort of justice, social justice, where, so again, you understand the system, but you have taken a different route and you say, no, I'm going to challenge this and I try to improve the system. And probably the third category of people would be, you're like, this has been going on for ages and I don't think I can do much about it. So I'm going to just go about doing my job and let the politicians or the civil servants or the business people or the lawmakers figure out. So where do you see yourself going?
I'm certainly not much of an activist in this type of system, but I think I'm just sort of someone who wants to understand what's going on rather than anything else, because I think I know enough about the system to know that I know nothing. So trying to know as much as I possibly can and understand how both sides play the game is where I see myself. Okay,
good. That was a very diplomatic reply. If you have access to Amazon Prime, look up this channel called BritBox, and they stream BBC serials. And in the BritBox, there is this sitcom called Yes Minister. And then the subsequent version of that was yes, Prime Minister. And you will get a first-hand knowledge of how the laws are made. Of course, it's in the British context, but it gives you a very excellent idea of how laws are made and what kind of interaction goes on between the civil servants and the lawmakers, and how actual public good takes a backseat. Okay, if you get time, do watch that. Thank you, Jay, again.
Thank you.
Nikhil, you're muted. I don't.
Oh, I'm sorry. Last speaker today is Brooks. Brooks, how do you say your last name?
Temple.
Temple. He's a senior economics and accounting double major at Guilford College. Brooks is also an avid athlete. He played 4 seasons on Guilford's football team, garnering academic all-conference honors twice and received the team's Scholar Athlete Award in 2019. Brooks has interned with JP Morgan Chase and will start his full-time job with them and upon his graduation May 2022. Brooks' honors paper is titled Risk or Fix: How the Pandemic Policy Responses Has Changed the US Corporate Bond Market. Brooks.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen real quick. Okay. Thank you, Nikhil. As he said, my research is entitled Risk or Fix: How the Pandemic Policy Response Has Worked Through the US Corporate Bond Market. And in this paper, I argue that while the Fed's policy measures were necessary in March 2020 to combat the crisis brought on by the pandemic, 2 years later here, we're just now realizing the effects of those policies, and they bring new risks to the economy and financial stability. And in order to understand the pandemic policy response, we first must need to look at the policy experimentation that took place following the Great Recession. And this begins with the fall in the level of prices, in price level, excuse me. In December 2008, prices of real goods and services only increased by 0.1%. Fed officials were afraid of a price deflation scenario that would lead to chronic unemployment like the Great Depression. And so as a result, the Fed lowered short-term interest rates to 0%. And out of fear that that would not be enough, for the first time in US economic history, the Fed engaged in large-scale asset purchases, also known as quantitative easing. This policy experimentation purchased large amounts of mortgage-backed securities and treasury securities over a period of 3 rounds and over a period of several years. And this expansion and this recovery is defined by a slow recovery in the labor market. At the peak of the first quantitative easing operation, the unemployment rate only declined to 9.7%, and it took several years before the Fed had their first interest rate increase and recovery in the labor market down to 5% unemployment. And this is due to the large deleveraging situation in the real economy. Firms were reluctant to borrow, and banks were afraid to lend. And as you can see, it took non-financial corporate debt levels several years to return to pre-crisis levels, as real firms were financing capital investment and hiring workers using real profits. And as the economy, this expansion continued, firms became more comfortable borrowing and taking on more levels of debt. And as you can see in the later years of this expansion, this trend reversed as they took on high levels of debt and profit levels had fallen. And this let the economy susceptible to a shock. And that shock came in March 2020 as the unemployment rate spiked to 14% in April. And once again, the Fed was afraid of chronic unemployment like there was in the Great Recession. And there was a similar trend in price level as prices only increased 0.5% in March 2020. And instead of experimenting with policy, and instead of acting over 3 rounds, the Fed acted immediately, purchasing unlimited amounts of Treasury securities and mortgage-backed securities. As you can see, the Fed's holdings of Treasury securities increased about 2 trillion in just a matter of months. And there's a similar trend with mortgage-backed securities increasing about $600 billion in a short period of time instead of over several years, like it did in response to the Great Recession. And in financial markets, financial participants fled riskier securities like investment grade bonds, investment grade corporate bonds, and high yield corporate bonds as they bought 10-year treasury securities. This can be seen as through the higher yields on the riskier securities, with high yield peaking at 11.9% and investment grade peaking at 4.2% on March 23rd, 2020. And this is a conceptual model of the crisis in the corporate bond market and the problem that it poses for firms in the real economy. When holders of securities sell corporate bonds, this increases the supply on the market. This lowers the prices of these assets and increases the yields. This poses a challenge for two problems for firms in the real economy. Because of the pandemic, they needed cash to meet immediate obligations. And so if they were to issue new debt, there would be limited buyers and they would have to issue the debt at higher interest rates. And when they issued the debt at higher interest rates, this would put more cash flow towards interest payments as opposed to hiring workers and spending on capital investment. So this creates a lag on the economy and causes firms to lay off workers. And to combat this problem, let me go back real quick. To combat this problem, the Fed introduced the emergency lending facilities targeting primary issuance from investment banks and really targeting the investment grade corporate bonds and the secondary market, targeting the fallen angels, so to speak, falling down to non-investment grade. And they purchased both of these securities, but they released information through press releases and forward guidance that greatly affected the yields on these securities, starting with investment grade corporate bonds. You see immediately after the announcement and after the announcement of the total credit support, yields on investment grade corporate bonds declined from 4.2% to pre-crisis levels, which is where the black line is at 2.5%. And you can see with each announcement announcing new pricing information, they declined further below 2.05% all the way down to about 1.9%, about 15 basis point decrease. And in late summer of 2020, the Fed decided that economic conditions warranted more support. So they extended the emergency lending facilities. And you saw a further reduction of yields from about 1.8%, reaching about 1.75%. And in response to this, because firms were cash strapped and needed to make immediate obligations, they were able to borrow and issue new debt at similar rates pre-crisis levels, as issuance exploded to 296 billion for investment grade companies in April 2020. And a similar trend happened with high yield corporate bonds. High yield bonds peaked at 11.9% at the initial announcement, and then further lowered to about 7% in a matter of a couple months. And after the Fed decided to expand eligible counterparties to include a diversified portfolio and ETFs in their purchases, you can see an immediate reduction in yields following that announcement, about a 30 basis point reduction. And then after the Fed extended their emergency lending facilities, this put high yield corporate bonds all the way down to their pre-crisis levels at about 5.6%. And you saw a similar trend in issuance, with issuance exploding to about 58 billion in June 2020 and over 50 billion in August 2020 after the announcement of the facility extension. And what's interesting about this program is the primary market corporate credit facility was never used. It never actually purchased primary issuance. all of these purchases included bonds on the secondary market, and it peaked at about 46 billion. Now, let me remind you that the total size of the facility was about $750 billion. And so there was very little purchasing. So the announcement and the forward guidance gave confidence to participants in the bond market. And so this is a conceptual model of the unclogging and the recovery in the bond market. Throughout the Fed's announcements assuring that there would be a buyer available for corporate bonds, this increased demand for both of the securities, increasing asset prices and lowering yields on the securities. Now, firms can issue new debt at lower interest rates or near pre-crisis levels. And so this can start a recovery, and they can put more cash flow towards hiring instead of spending money on interest payments. And an interesting trend throughout after the extension of the facilities and after support was removed in 2021, you saw high yield corporate bond yields decline from about 4.7% and hitting all-time lows at 4.4%. And with this, because of this, in non-investment grade firms took advantage, and you see a record level of issuance in March 2021 at about 62 billion. And the red line right there is at 22 billion, which represents the pre-crisis borrowing levels. And you could, as you can see, there were only 2 monthly issuance dates that were below this pre-crisis level. So you have a lot of firms taking advantage of lower interest rates and extending maturity dates on debt. And while many analysts thought this was a good thing, and that firms were able to save money on interest payments and extend maturity dates, you can see a mountain of maturity payments in coming due in 2025 and 2024. This poses a problem if firms have to borrow more and in a higher interest rate, in a rising interest rate environment, because this can actually increase their interest payments if they have these large maturity payments coming due. So what I did was I conducted a sensitivity analysis to kind of model this situation on retail corporate giant Macy's. And this was Macy's maturity payments at the end of 2020. As you can see, they needed a lot of cash to get through the pandemic and act as a bridge until consumer demand returned. And they have a large maturity payment in 2025 and after 2026. Well, after 2021, where you saw record low borrowing costs, they eliminated this payment in 2025 and lowered total indebtedness and extended maturity payments. However, as supply chain pressures persisted throughout the economy and the Fed is beginning to raise rates and there's a prospect of slower growth, I wanted to model a situation where Macy's would have to refinance at higher interest rates. And so here is a screenshot of my model. And I assumed that there was a recession scenario in 2022 and slower growth in subsequent years. And I assumed that debt would be refinanced at 200 basis points higher than the original interest rate. And one thing I would like to highlight here is that the interest coverage ratio and leverage levels, interest coverage ratio is declining to about 6.2 times, and leverage levels are increasing. And so this poses a problem for a company like Macy's or another company that has a similar maturity profile as Macy's, because this can affect their credit rating and future borrowing, the future ability to borrow for that company. And lastly, as the Fed has accumulated a lot of assets in their portfolio, and now that there's inflation coming due, they're going to have to reduce their asset holdings. And if the Fed does not unwind properly, it does not give forward guidance to market participants, this can lead to a price spiral and force primary dealers to absorb treasury securities. And if they sell too fast, too quick, this can cause a price spiral in treasury securities, lowering the price of these assets, increasing the yields, and lowering the prices and increasing borrowing costs for riskier assets as well, leaving firms susceptible to higher interest rates and a lower borrowing and a deleverage level, threatening financial stability and developments in the real economy moving forward. I'd like to open it up to questions.
Any questions for Brooks?
Yes, Jay.
Hi, so okay, so this may be a bit of an oversimplification, but essentially a lot of what you're saying was when the Fed raises rates, the yields go down. It just sort of has this antithetical correlation, right?
Yes.
So now that the pandemic, well, I mean, it's definitely not over yet, but assuming that it gets a lot better and like vaccines become a lot better, are you saying that it would be better for the Fed to raise rates, driving demand down, or
So, yeah, great question. And I apologize. I'm trying to cover a lot of information in a short amount of time. But so what I'm saying is that because of this inflation, the Fed has they've already raised, they did a 25 basis point increase, and they're going to have to raise rates. And they're going to have to find a way to cool inflation and restore price stability. And Chairman Powell has been very outspoken about that, and he's willing to do that. What I'm saying is that it needs to be communicated very effectively. And they have to let market participants know, hey, this is what we're doing. This is how much we're going to reduce our asset holdings, because if you do it too quick and it's unexpected, you can cause a sell-off of riskier securities.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Anyone else? Yeah, I was going to ask you the same question. You know, I've heard, I was reading in Wall Street Journal that the Fed is thinking of increasing the interest rates to combat the inflation, which is probably the highest in probably the last 40 years, right?
Yeah.
So I'm glad you mentioned that issue. So for a common investor perspective, did you think about any possible outcomes or suggestions or recommendations, people who, who invest in bonds markets?
For people who invest in bond markets, I would probably,
or people who have other investments, like, for professors, there is this organization called TIAA, who manage their pension funds and all. And typically they look at market volatility and decide whether to, invest in equities or bonds or what to do with it.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if, you have any recommendations for institutional investors or for individual investors?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say my recommendations for asset managers or these institutional investors, I think an obvious one would be to find a way to find securities and assets tied to real estate. You have real estate investment trusts. Those are seen as inflation safe, as they can just raise rent, and they can still perform very well during those times. I would say there's also one thing that has gained popularity is the TIPS. It's the Treasury inflation protected bond. And so it compensates you for inflation if inflation were to persist. But I would be very wary of getting into bonds right now, because the prices are going to decline. And Chairman Powell said that that it's going to be faster than last time. So because of that, and because I think of my expected volatility in that market, I would kind of stay away. I'd stay more away from bonds and try to find bonds maybe tied to real estate and securities tied to some of those inflation protected assets.
Okay. Now, this is not related to your topic as such, but I don't know if you have any comment on this, and maybe we can have a quick discussion. So as the inflation goes up, and I'm trying to tie this into the previous discussion, Alexis talks about, the different generations of, people coming into the workforce. And it seems like the Gen Z is probably going to have to bear the brunt of this inflationary trends, so as to say. And I'm wondering if salaries are going to increase simultaneously or not.
That's the interesting part. So right now with inflation, usually it's attributed to, higher demand and because of the supply chain issues in the pandemic, and wage inflation has not become embedded in the numbers we're seeing right now. But I think you can see there's a this is kind of outside the scope of this project, but you saw a reduction in the labor market declining by, I think, like 3% before the pandemic. And so
Right.
you have a shortage of workers. And so right now the bargaining power is with the workers. And so workers can demand higher wages. And you see it, for me, I see it in banking, like entry-level jobs, analysts are demanding higher pay for higher hours. And there's many other professional industries where that's happening. So I think that it's not as bad. I would like to kind of point this timing and to maybe Alexis, her presentation in the 1970s, where you had a lot of labor unions and you had inflation indexed wages. And so when inside their contract, inflation was indexed to where they'd have to pay them by the amount prices rose. And so that's how it really got out of control in the 1970s. Hopefully the Fed can manage this situation and we don't get super high inflation like then, and we have less labor unions as well because of that. So that's kind of like my thoughts on the employment. I'm glad you brought that up as far as the bargaining power and the wage inflation.
I'm glad you had an opinion on this. And, keep in mind, from a Generation Z perspective, you all are seeing so much, the Russia-Ukraine war, the pandemic and its impact on the global standing of the United States, and the political environment that the country has seen. And Alexis talked a little bit about that. And from a financial perspective, I'm wondering if this inflation is going to dent the value of the US dollar. And the subsequent buying power.
That's a real possibility.
Yeah. So it's all, you are experiencing so many interesting ups and downs, which in the future, 10 years, 15 years down the line, when you look back at this time, you'll be like, phew, what times did we go through? And, but these are interesting times, to say the least, right?
Absolutely.
On that note, I thank you all for this excellent group of presentations. Alexis, Jay, Brooks, it's really interesting to listen to what research you all are doing. Continue doing this. My best wishes to all of you. Any parting comments or questions?
This was really interesting. Thank you, all of you. Yeah, this was really great.
Great. Yeah. Good luck to all of you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.